Good afternoon and welcome to the 2024 USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging's Monday Seminar Series. Before introducing today's speaker, let me remind you to ask your questions for our speaker using the Q&A icon located on your webinar toolbar. Please do not use the chat box. You can add questions to the Q&A at any time during presentation. No need to wait until the end of the presentation. And today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Erfei Zhao. Mr. Zhao is currently a PhD candidate in gerontology at the University of Southern California under the mentorship of Dr. Eileen Crimmins. Prior to matriculating at USC, he received a BA from Washington University and a master's in social work from Columbia. His thesis research is focused on understanding socio-demographic disparities in kidney function, but today he will present findings from other work that he's doing at USC in a presentation titled Age Trajectories of Diseases, Functional Limitations, Psychological and Cognitive Well-Being of Centenarians and Non-Centenarians in the Health and Retirement Study. And with that, let me turn the microphone over to Mr. Zhao.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the amazing and detailed introduction. That was a much needed confidence boost that I needed to finish my dissertation. So thank you so much for tuning in. The topic of my presentation today is, like Paul said, the age trajectories of diseases, functional limitation, psychological and cognitive well-being of centenarians and non-centenarians in the health and retirement study. My name is Erfei Zhao. I am a PhD candidate from University of Southern California School of Gerontology under the mentorship of Dr. Eileen Crimmins and Dr. Jennifer Alshire. First of all, why should we care about centenarians, right? There are two main reasons. I'm particularly interested in this population because, one, it is one of the fastest growing segment of the global population. In the United States alone, the population went from 53,000 in 2010 to over 90,000 in 2020. The second reason this population is really interesting is because they exhibit very low incident rates for common age-related conditions. For example, heart diseases, diabetes, cancer, functional limitation, and cognition. And therefore, this population have been proposed as a model of healthy aging. So in order to study this population, there has been many paradigms. One of the paradigms is the decelerated aging model to study healthy aging among centenarians. So what does that mean? We can see here, according to the model, age trajectories can be depicted as accelerated, normal, and decelerated, depending on the age of onset of age-related diseases and initial clinical symptoms, and the rate of aging. So how does this model relate to centenarians? As we can see here, while deterioration linked to age is inevitable, for centenarians, it appears that clinical symptoms are usually delayed or even sometimes avoided because they appear to have greater resilience against age-associated declines, which can be reflected in the slower rate of aging. However, to our best knowledge, and surprisingly, no studies have really captured this rate of decline, which is the key in quantifying the degree of resilience among centenarians in various health domains. Therefore, for our study, we aim to quantify and compare age trajectories in diseases, physical functioning, psychological health, and cognition between centenarians and non-centenarians. We'll be performing joint point regression analysis to determine slopes of trajectories and the exact age in which acceleration and deceleration occurs among centenarians versus non-centenarians. Also, this is not news to anyone, but we do know that the aging experiences can be very different for male and female older adults. even though the reality is much more complex and nuanced than this. But generally, we found that in most cases, men are living with more lethal diseases, such as cardiovascular diseases, and women tend to have more chronic illnesses, but not lethal, such as more functioning limitation and depressive symptoms. So we are also curious to see how this sex difference is reflected in the health trajectories, which is also reflect the onset and rate of health decline among centenarians. In terms of data, we are using the assets and health dynamics among the oldest old cohort of the health and retirement study. To begin with, we included 5,700 HRS respondents who were born 1920 or earlier who could have survived to age 100 by the 2020 survey wave. We found that about 204 of them survived to at least the age of 100 and are categorized as centenarians. Those that did not make it to 100 are considered non-centenarians. Because both centenarians and non-centenarians belong to the same cohort, we overcame a major limitation of existing research in which only a handful of studies have compared centenarians with appropriate controls, which are the non-surviving members of their birth cohort. Further, among the studies that did use non-surviving cohort members as controls, they didn't really examine people who died at different ages separately. And this could lead to confounding interpretations, right? For example, people who died in their 70s and those that died in their 90s can have very different age experiences and health trajectories leading up to their deaths. Therefore, in our study, we categorized the non-surviving cohort members into those that passed away between the age of 73-year-old to 79-year-old, categorized as septuagenarians, 80 to 89-year-old, who are categorized as octogenarians, and 90 to 99-year-old, who are categorized as nonagenarians. Based on this criterion, 506 respondents died between the age of 73 to 79 and are categorized as septuagenarians. 2,699 are categorized as octogenarians, and 2,291 died as nonagenarians. And our hypothesis is that the older the age group, the more resilience they have against age-related decline. We hypothesize that centenarians will have the most decelerated aging, and people who died in their 70s will have the most accelerated aging. In terms of our measurements, first, we are looking at diseases and conditions. We created a count variable of the number of self-reports of doctor diagnosis of diseases and conditions among 6 leading causes of death, which include cardiovascular diseases, stroke, diabetes, cancer, chronic lung disease, and high blood pressure. We then also assess psychological well-being. We use the Modified Center of Epidemiologic Studies depression scale. Respondents are asked whether during the past week they felt depressed, whether they felt everything that did was an effort, whether they felt restless when sleeping, whether they felt lonely, whether they felt like they could not get going, whether they felt sad, enjoyed life, or happy. Respondents with scores over 3 are considered depressed and are coded as 1, otherwise 0. Another important aspect of health is the physical limitation, which is measured by activities of daily living ranging from 0 to 6, and instrumental activities of daily living ranging from 0 to 5. Lastly, we're also assessing the cognitive functioning, which is measured with a 35-point scale that assesses working memory, processing speed, orientation, knowledge, and language. And this is adapted from the telephone interview of cognitive status and have been validated for use in population surveys. Scores of 8 or less indicate severe cognitive impairment among older adults, specifically aged 70 and above. And lastly, I also want to mention the way we measured for the proxy respondents. For respondents who are not able to complete a cognitive interview themselves, HRS actually established a way to assess their cognitive ability by asking questions to proxy respondents. This is particularly important for assessing cognition at a population level, because in many cases, people that cannot complete the interviews are those who do have some level of cognitive impairment. So in order to prevent our sample to become too selective, we used the Langa-Weir classification of cognitive function. This classification is basically a combination of IADL's proxy assessment of respondents' memory and interviewers' assessment of respondents' cognition, which create a total cognition score based on proxy information ranging from 0 to 11. And people scored over 5 are considered demented. Then I want to quickly go over the analytic strategies that we're using for the study. First, very straightforward, we are just going to plot the age trajectories of each health domain stratified by people's survival status. Then we'll perform the joint point regression to determine the age in which there is a change in the rate of decline and the slopes before and after that breakpoint. So essentially what joint point regression does is that it assumes data can be divided into subsets, each with their own linear trend. For the health trajectory that do not fit the joint point model, we assume they do not have multiple slopes and thus use linear regression analyses. And finally, we will compare these trajectories by sex. So first, let's take a look at the functioning trajectory for those dying in different decades. I want to take the time to quickly go over what the graphs is. So the x-axis is basically age, and the y-axis is the number of ADLs that a respondent experienced over time. So for example, if we see the firm blue line here, it's the trajectories for the ADL trajectories for septuagenarians. And as we can see, the line stops right at the age of 80 because all respondents in this group, they pass away before the age of 80. And the same thing applies to the other 3 groups. Octogenarians, they all pass away by the age of 90. Nonagenarian all pass away by the age of 100, and centenarians, they go on to age of 105. So what can we see here? We observe that on average, people who live longer generally have more resilience against functioning decline, which is reflected by slower rates of change and also the delay in the first ADL and IADL onset. For ADLs in particular, people who died as septuagenarians have the most accelerated rates of increase in ADLs and earliest onset of ADL with an average of 1 at the age of roughly 77-year-old. People who died as octogenarians have the second most accelerated rate and have their first ADL delayed until the age of 82. And people who died as nonagenarians have their first ADL at roughly the age of 88. Centenarians, on the other hand, have the slowest increase in ADL and delay their first onset until the age of nearly 94. For IADLs, the trajectories are fairly similar to ADLs. People who died later generally have slower overall rate of increase in IADLs and therefore later onset. On average, people who died between the age of 73 to 79 experienced first onset of IADL at 77. People who died as octogenarians have first onset of IADL at the age of 82. And people who died as nonagenarians have their first onset at 87, and centenarians further delayed the onset till the age of 94. What is really interesting here is that we can see after their non-surviving counterparts died, centenarians actually continue to experience loss in functioning and generally have very high IADLs and ADLs, higher their non-surviving counterparts right before their death. As we can see here, the yellow dotted lines, they all go way above than their non-surviving members. So I also want to quickly show the joint point regression results. Essentially, these two graphs, they are telling the same story, right? They are both age trajectories of ADLs and IADLs. However, the joint point regression tells you exactly where the slope changes. For example, if we take the centenarian dotted yellow line as an example, we can see from the descriptive age trajectories, we can kind of see, there is acceleration happening here, roughly here. But it's very hard for us to determine what exact age that acceleration occurs. So joint point regression, it does a really good job in telling us here, we see a very clear acceleration at the age of 93. Our joint point regression results suggest older adults experience some level of acceleration and functioning decline, roughly at the age in which their average first onset of ADL and IADL. And this acceleration is particularly apparent for centenarians, right? While centenarians may have the most resilience against age-related decline in ADLs and IADLs at earlier ages, they actually lose this advantage in their early 90s, which can be reflected by the heightened rates of increase in the numbers of ADLs and IADLs. And those that survive to the oldest age, centenarians end up having the highest number of ADLs and IADLs before their death. This observation indicates that centenarians experience a compression of morbidity and disability until the end of their lives, and they will continue to experience deterioration in functioning before they die, despite their higher resilience in their 70s and 80s. I would also like to show the sex difference in ADLs. There is a very consistent increase in resilience with age for both men and women. However, we do observe that women have less resilience against ADLs, which is reflected by the faster rates of change and therefore earlier onsets. For example, we can see how the male nonagenarian's resilience is nearly as high as that of female centenarians, in which the two lines almost overlaps. Again, the same story applies to sex difference in IADL as well. There is a very consistent increase in resilience with age in both men and women. However, women have less resilience against IADLs and also earlier onset. And this sex gap appears to be bigger for older age groups. Then let's look at diseases and conditions. We found linear relationship between numbers of diseases and age for all age groups. People that die later have later onset of diseases and have lower rates of increase with age, and therefore consistently high resilience. Again, what's interesting here is, contrary to ADLs and IADLs, centenarians actually do not develop as many diseases as those that died earlier in their oldest age. And our observation is pretty much in agreement with previous research, in which centenarians generally display less comorbidities and have a less steep rise of comorbidities over the final years before death, compared to nonagenarians, octogenarians. Centenarians also have fewer accumulated number of diseases throughout older adulthood, which can be observed by the baseline difference here. which is likely caused by their high resilience throughout the life course before the age of our observation period. Interestingly, we don't see any apparent sex difference in diseases trajectories. So the last time I presented these presentations at GSA last year, it's also actually when I met Sarah. And some people raised some really interesting questions about about the trajectory of specific diseases and conditions, because sometimes it can be quite confounding if we lump all the major diseases together, right? So here I also included the age trajectory for each disease, and we can find some pretty interesting findings here as well. So similar to the previous graph, people that die later generally develop diseases at a later age, right? And have lower rates of increase with age and therefore consistently higher resilience. However, we do observe that the percentages for each disease definitely vary a lot. For example, about 40% of centenarians end up having heart diseases. It looks like most centenarians escape chronic lung disease, except for when they reach the really, really old age. And about 20% of centenarians have a lifetime history of cancer. And this pattern is not too obvious compared to their non-surviving members. For the other three diseases, we found that many centenarians actually appear to escape diabetes as a group, but many of them do not escape stroke and hypertension. Our findings kind of match previous research in which approximately 16 to 20% of centenarians experience heart disease, stroke, or non-skin cancer before the age of 80 and survive 20 or more years with a diagnosis of a disease that is typically associated with a significant mortality risk in the general older population. So if we take cancer as an example, what's really interesting about cancer is that some researchers noted that although cancer death accounted for nearly 40% of all death occurring in adults between the age of 50 and 69 years old, only 4% of all deaths were due to cancer among centenarians. Cancer incidence and cause of death present a threefold decrease after age 90 and reach 0 to 4% above the age of 100. And it is characterized by a slow growth and a modest life-threatening potential. So it is really interesting to see how centenarians do not only delay aging, some of them are also able to live such a long part of their lives without the history of a presence of one or more of these lethal diseases, and during the most vulnerable period of their adult lives. Then let's take a look at psychological well-being. We found that people that die at older ages develop depression at a slower rate. So current literature suggests a large degree of heterogeneity among studies of centenarian psychological status. Some studies show that centenarians are not necessarily less depressed than younger cohorts. Others show that some centenarians may have good mental health despite reduced level of physical health and social resources, indicating high resilience to adapt to age-associated challenges. Some studies have shown that male and female offspring of centenarians scored in the low range of neuroticism and in the high range for extroversion. Women also scored comparatively high in agreeableness among centenarians. So our results may provide some empirical explanation for these mixed findings regarding psychological health among the oldest old. We found that people died as nonagenarians generally have the lowest and also slowest overall trajectories in decline of psychological health than septuagenarians and octogenarians. However, for centenarians, even although they also experience low baseline and slow rate of increase in depression, as we can see here, we do observe some spikes when they reach the age of 100, which could be potentially due to the loneliness as people around centenarians tend to pass away first. For all groups, there is a very clear male advantage and resilience against depression, and sex seems to play a more dominant role than the age groups in which people die. Finally, for cognition, I am showing both the descriptive age trajectory and also the joint point regression results. People who die at older ages have slower decline in cognitive performance. However, So here it should be cognitive impairment raises at the most accelerated rate among centenarians after the age of 90. And for both sexes, people that die at older ages have more resilience against age-related cognitive decline. Women have accelerated decline than men, and this acceleration becomes more apparent in extreme old age. So overall, our analysis provides very solid empirical evidence in which people who die at later age tend to experience more decelerated aging in all domains of health. It appears that centenarians show the most resilience against age-related deterioration in physical health, both in terms of diseases and functioning, psychological and cognitive functioning than non-centenarian. However, although as a group, centenarians share the unique trait of being longevity outliers, they likely vary in their age experience based on previous research as well. Emerging studies of centenarians found that although some centenarians remain healthy and functional, some do live with disease and diminished functioning. So we want to further our analysis and by using an existing classification approach to define 3 centenarians' survival pathways, which are escapers, delayers, and survivors. In our study, escapers are defined as those who had no diseases or functional loss at the time of the first interview or the last interview. For instance, centenarians who show no signs of cognitive impairment over time were considered to have escaped cognitive impairment. Delayers are those that had no diseases or functional loss at baseline, but had by their last interview. For example, those who had no ADL limitation at baseline, but were limited in at least one activity by the time they reached 100. By the time they reached the last interview, they were considered to have delayed disability. And finally, survivors are those people who had already had some level of disease or functioning loss at both the baseline and the final interview. We observe and compare their age trajectories and also their baseline characteristics. So we do observe there are multiple paths to becoming a centenarian, right? There is some level of heterogeneity in the survival experience of centenarians, which suggests that both compression and expansion of morbidity and disability are occurring within the population of centenarians. Although centenarians are generally healthier than their non-surviving counterparts, this figure really nicely shows the distribution of centenarians across the 3 survival pathways: escapers, delayers, and survivors. We found that only about 16 to 18% of HRS centenarians have successfully escaped disability. The prevalence of independence is much lower in our study compared with 20 to 40% reported in some other studies of centenarians. Most centenarians eventually get ADLs and IADLs, or they already have some level of functional limitation at baseline. Only about 1/5 of centenarians did not have any diseases. Most centenarians delayed diseases or already have some disease at baseline. In our sample of centenarians, 38% remained cognitively intact over the study period, confirming that dementia is not an inevitable condition of living longer lives. So let's take a closer look at the different centenarian survival pathways. For ADL, centenarians obviously have very different ADL trajectories. 38 of them never reported any ADLs. 50 of them always had some ADLs, and 119 of them do not experience ADL until the age of 93, but do kind of catch up to the survivals towards the older ages. Centenarian aging trajectories also differed according to some sociodemographic characteristics. Compared to the survivors, people that escaped or delayed ADLs are generally younger at baseline, less likely to be women, have more years of education, more likely to be married or partnered, less likely to be widowed, and more likely to be in the younger cohorts. Very similarly, centenarians have different IADL trajectories as well. 33 of them never reported any IADLs. 56 of them already had some IADLs at the baseline, and 118 of them have their first IADL onset on average at the age of 94. Similar to ADLs, compared to survivors, people that escaped or delayed IADLs are generally younger, have more years of education, more likely to be married, partner, less likely to be widowed, and more likely to be in the younger cohorts. In terms of diseases, we found that most centenarians already had some diseases at baseline. 65 of them delayed diseases onset until the age of 93. And compared to the survivors, other than people that delayed IDLs being generally younger at baseline, we don't really observe other social patterns. Centenarians also have different trajectory for depression. 90 of them went from having no depression to having depression. 52 of them had no depression at baseline and still no depression at the last wave. And 59 of them have depression at baseline and also depression at the last wave of interview. But they could experience some fluctuation during the observing period. Compared to survivors, people that escaped or delayed depression are younger at baseline, less likely to be female, and more likely to be in the younger cohorts. Finally, in terms of cognition, only 42 centenarians always had cognitive impairment. 78 of them escaped them, and for delayers, they delayed cognitive impairment until the age of 81. We also found that non-Hispanic whites and those with higher level of education were more likely to remain cognitively intact, confirming that social patterning and cognitive functioning observed at earlier ages can persist even among centenarians. Married people are also more likely to delay cognitive impairment. In conclusion, our analysis provides solid empirical evidence in which people who die at later age tend to experience more decelerated aging in all domains of health. It appears that centenarians show the most resilience against age-related deterioration in physical health, psychological, and cognitive functioning than non-centenarians. Among those that did not survive past the age of 100, we also observe a very clear gradient in terms of rate of aging by decade of death. People who died the earliest, also, for example, people who pass away in their 70s have relatively the most accelerated aging in all health domains, and those who died latest in their 90s have the most decelerated aging. These patterns are also consistent for both sexes. However, we do observe some heterogeneity among centenarians' aging experiences. In particular, male centenarians tend to be healthier than their female counterparts. It is likely that the men who are able to achieve the very old age must be especially fit and delay or escape potentially lethal illnesses practically until their centenarian years. Finally, I also want to point out that our results show some very interesting parallels across the health domains. In comparison to their non-surviving counterparts, it appears that centenarians, right before they die, have a smaller number of diseases, but much higher functioning limitation than their non-surviving counterparts before their death. This kind of indicates that although many centenarians were able to avoid certain diseases, they cannot avoid age-related physiological change in terms of physical functioning. Similarly, for cognition, as people continue to age, their cognitive functioning also continues to decline and reach a new lowest point. These findings, in a way, provide some insights in which being high functioning, both cognitively and physically, may play a very key role in not only predicting mortality amongst the oldest old, but also prolonging life expectancy in general. Finally, I want to say our study also made an important distinction between centenarians' resilience against diseases and conditions versus functioning. Although they have resilience in both domains, so that they have later onset and slower rate, centenarians are generally able to manifest less diseases and conditions throughout lifetime, but they appear to continue to experience increasing physiological change leading up to their death. So there has been this advocacy coming from the World Health Organization. They advocated to shift the focus from disease to capacity among older adults. And our study serves a very important reminder to not only diagnose disease at a particular point in time, but also monitor functioning trajectory across the life course, which may be a better indicator for mortality, but may also help discover what interventions can enhance the intrinsic capacity for the older adults. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening and paying attention.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. There are currently no questions in the Q&A, so I'll take advantage of that and ask the first question. And that's, are there any plans? I know that there are dietary data available in the health and retirement study. Are there any plans to actually look at the role of diet and the resilience in this group?
Oh, Paul, I am so sorry. Am I looking at the right question?
No. I'm asking. I was going to ask the first question because there were no questions in the queue.
I see.
Just my question would be,
Yeah.
Are there any plans that you're aware of to actually look at the role of diet in resilience in this group of centenarians?
Do I have any plans to observe different diet?
Yeah, yeah. Do you plan to do that, or do you know of anybody who's planning to do that?
Not that I know of. I mean, diet probably plays a very important role in determining one's longevity, right? But I wish to incorporate more diet factors into my future centenarian studies.
Okay. All right. So the next question comes from Shandong Wang, and he asks, it says it's interesting that centenarians died much less on cancer than non-centenarians. I was wondering what types of cancer the centenarians had, and if there was any difference or specific type of cancer between centenarians and non-centenarians.
Right, that is a really, really good question. So from the analysis that I'm doing right now, I wasn't really able to look at the specific type of cancer. The only thing I know is that I excluded skin cancer. So centenarians, in some way, even though they are getting the same types of cancers based on our analysis, right? Even though they are sort of getting the same types of cancer, they are still able to survive them, or at least they are more, the chances of them surviving is much, much higher for centenarians from what I learned from previous research. But it will be really interesting for us to look into this more specific types of cancer, which I'm sure there are some research out there already, but I should look into that. Thank you.
The next question comes from Gil Blanda, who asks, is there any effect of ethnic background on survival and disease mix?
On their survival and disease mix. Yes. So I believe, let me see. In terms of the different survival pathways for centenarians, we did find that cognition is patterned by some ethnic backgrounds. Non-Hispanic whites, they are more likely to escape cognitive impairment entirely. And disease, I didn't get to examine oh, actually, okay. So for the different survival paths, we actually didn't really observe significant ethnic difference for the diseases among centenarians. But maybe if we look at specific disease, we can observe a difference. But right now, if we are putting all 6 diseases together, the outcome is not significant. But I think the next step would be to look at them separately and see if there is a significant effect of ethnic background. Great question. Thank you, Gil.
Next question comes from Sarah Booth, and she asks, given your findings, how do you reconcile the current enthusiasm for seeking treatments to extend life with the burden on healthcare?
To extend life with the burden of healthcare. Wow, that is a really great and loaded question. Short answer, I don't know. I mean, that is the $1 million question, right? I don't know. I think studying centenarians and extending people's longevity obviously is, what people are really curious about because we all want to live forever, right? But I think another aspect of that is extending those lives and the quality of life that we get for these extra years. And I think in a way, we kind of have to look into the preventive measures in order for us to shift from, spending so much on trying to cure the diseases, trying to save people when they are already ill. But if we can shift the focus to more preventive measures, for example, changing people's behaviors in their, like in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and changing their diet behaviors, right? I think there are definitely already so many available ways for us to extend life and improve quality of life without having to keep burdening the healthcare system.
Okay, the next, Stephanie, Tanya Lamonfava asks the next question, and she asks a much less loaded question. Is there a trend for sex differences in survival?
Is there a trend for sex difference in survival? Is there a trend for sex differences in survival? I am not too entirely sure if you are referring to the survival pathways here, but if you are referring to the survival pathways, there is definitely some significant sex differences. First of all, it's very consistent that people who die at later ages, they have more resilience, right? And they are able to, if they're able to survive to later ages. But among the centenarians, among those people that already are surviving to the oldest age, we still observe a very clear sex difference. For example, it is much more likely for male centenarians to completely avoid ADLs and IEDLs. And it seems like for men, if they want to really survive, they have to be just extra fit. They have to avoid all these really critical major diseases in their 70s and 80s, and then go on to stay healthy and fit in their 90s and 100. But those who do, they're usually exceptional. They have really exceptional health. I hope that answered your question. You can always chat with me in private later.
Okay. And the next question comes from Megan Farady, who asks, are there data on family support in the cohort? It was interesting to see marital status among the three categories. I was wondering if having children or grandchildren, sort of a marker of family support, is connected to more resilience in your cohort.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. That is a great question. I was this close to including numbers of children in this analysis, but I didn't. Since we did observe some significant differences between people that are married and partnered versus people that are single, and we also observe some significant difference for people that are widowed versus people who are not. I imagine family structures having support from children and grandchildren should play a pretty significant part in the pathways of centenarians. So that would be a very good next step for us to look at. Thank you.
Okay. And I think, unless there's any questions being typed in right now, I'll wait a few seconds here, but I think that might be the last question. I'll just wait another.
Sure.
But seeing no other questions popping up, I would like to thank you for a very interesting presentation, and wish you best of luck with your future research and your dissertation.
Thank you so much, Paul.